Hello, bruvs. We're back with whatever this is called. Beer Money by Francis Stroh. And I'm trying to get this book over so I can move on to a different book. But it's a rather long chapter. I think 20 pages or something. Homecoming. Let's see how many pages it actually is. It might not be 20. No, it wasn't that long. But I'm going to try to get most of it done so I don't have to read this anymore. Homecoming. Crete, 1997. Take it that's her father. Eric Stroh, but I don't know. Detroit, 2000. I know my brothers will like you, I assured my boyfriend. They'll like that you're Russian, first of all, and they'll definitely appreciate your cooking. We sped past Detroit, headed to Grosse Pointe on the Chrysler Freeway. We'd come from San Francisco, where we were living together. It was nearly our 3-year anniversary. In fact, my family was gathering for an annual business meeting, and though Arcady had already met my parents on several occasions, I was taking the opportunity to introduce him to my brothers. Even Charlie would be there. I'll cook them a great dinner, said Arcady in his thick Russian accent. Detroit had always looked bombed out, but now it seemed positively abandoned, with whole blocks of what appeared to be unoccupied houses. I knew many of the city's inhabitants had fled as late stage industrialization set in, but I'd had no idea just how bad things had become. This was the legacy of Coleman Young's 20 years in office. Young was a mayor who'd gloated as white businesses moved out, no matter how many black jobs were lost in the process. The desolation was the aftermath of short sighted union leaders who had tailored their policies to bolster the faltering automotive industry and line their own pockets. And the consequence of the big three automakers themselves, who for too long had refused to build smaller, cheaper, more fuel efficient cars to compete with their foreign counterparts. Now, with the retreat of the automotive industry to the suburbs and abroad, all signs of manufacturing had finally vanished in Detroit. Its smokestacks emitting no smoke, and many parts of the city only footprints of manufacturing plants remained where the buildings themselves had been leveled. Defunct cement silos dotted the riverfront because the city was too broke to take them down. Crack cocaine, the cornerstone of the new economy, was a difficult commodity to tax. I mean, that may be a little far stretching. I mean, this other part, I mean, you want to alienate 90% of the people who are going to read the book, and then you top it off by saying crack cocaine was the cornerstone of the new economy. Brilliant. Yet, all the devastation had given birth to Eminem and the Detroit underground hip hop scene, the first sign of life in a city that had been dying for decades. It had taken 40 years, but Detroit now had its signature music scene again, one that reflected the hopelessness of the times. Just as surely as 60s Motown had once mirrored the burgeoning black middle class sense of abundance and upward mobility. The Arrow Strait Freeway suddenly looped around the city at exactly the spot where the Stroh Brewery had once stood, its pinkish red letters lighting up the sky. When the Chrysler Freeway was built in the 60s, the city had mandated that every building in the interstate's path be raised, except the historic brewery. If only Coleman Young had shown us the same respect and level of consideration 17 years and $300 million later, the stampede of tenants he'd promised at Stroh River Place had never materialized. Our office building was half empty, our apartments and hotel lost in foreclosure. My family's arc was eerily parallel to Detroit's. We'd boomed together, and now we were failing together. That's where Stroh's beer was made, I told Arcady, pointing out the window. He frowned at the weed-filled expanse of derelict land. Unbelievable, he said, in a single word, deftly acknowledging all my family's losses since the demolition of the brewery 15 years ago. Too bad we can't drink Stroh's beer with the dinner I'm going to cook for you, he added cheerfully. Arcady was a world class amateur cook, one of the reasons I had fallen for him. We met on Crete in the summer of 1997, shortly after I'd left London. He was sleeping on the balcony of a partially built hotel under the stars. I was intrigued. I cannot sleep in rooms, he told me. I need air, not dust. We cooked lamb on the beach and drank wine straight from the bottle. He did weightlifting with actual rocks, his Olympic muscles as chiseled as those of the ancient Greek statues I'd seen in Athens. When he brought me Mediterranean salt water to heal a sinus infection, I nicknamed him the Bushman. He lifted the jar of murky water to my nostrils. Inhale, he commanded. For months, Arcady listened sympathetically to my family saga. I told him about the family ski trip in Jackson just after Christmas and how, with all the stress, I'd come down with the flu and had to extend my stay by 3 days, holed up in my hotel room and ordering French onion soup from room service. I convinced the airline to change my ticket back to London with no extra charges. My father appeared at the door of my room only once, holding his breath while dropping 2 Advil into the palm of my hand. When Alyssa, my father, and I checked out, my father told me, not a little sheepishly, that I would be responsible for covering the cost of my extra days, totaling about $900. I agreed to pay for 6 nights, he reminded me. Alyssa stood at my father's side, looking on with what seemed a certain satisfaction. Stunned, I pulled out my credit card. I had no idea how I would cover my rent back in London. I would move out of my flat, I decided, after using up my last month's rent deposit. It's a sad story, Arcady would say with conviction as we sat in this or that taverna, sipping Greek coffee. This would never happen in Russia. Never. But that's how I ended up in Greece, see, I told him, because it's dirt cheap. A man's daughter should always come first. Always. Arcady's values and opinions were as solid as the rocks he lifted on the beach. When it seemed my family situation had toppled my flimsy house of cards, Arcady provided strength and sanity. Our days on Crete were filled with mountain hikes, dips in the Mediterranean, yoga, and the preparation of 3 organic meals. Arcady knew nothing about contemporary art and had little money. Still, I felt nurtured when I was with him. As the weeks passed, the complexities of the art world in my family, supplanted by a program of rigorous self care, I developed a bodily sense of well being I had never before known. My newfound sense of calm felt totally unfamiliar, and I slept through the night for the first time in years, often after listening to Arcady play Russian gypsy songs on his balcony. Some days I felt perfectly at peace with the simplicity of my life on Crete, and yet there were other days when my body and mind seemed at odds, when I longed for the intellectual stimulation I'd left behind in London, the city's frenetic sense of potential. Even as the possibility of returning to that other life receded, the change in me happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the leftover summer now thawing on Crete's distant peaks. It happened incrementally, taking hold as we traversed the arid landscape, past tiny white chapels dotting the hillsides, or strolled along beaches fiercely drifted by the sirocco winds, our sun hats skipping across the sand in front of us, our skin whipped and welted, somewhere inside the casual rhythm of our days. I began to understand not just that my entire life would change, but that it had to. I needed more substance, less abstraction, more space in which to move around emotionally and physically, and fewer hang ups about money, fewer preconceptions. I would somehow find the way to depend on myself rather than others. While in my work, I would benefit perhaps from a medium in which to deal with real events and real feelings. Filmmaking, say, or writing. After Greece, Arcadia and I lived around the world for almost 2 years. New York, Kauai, Turkey, Kauai again before settling back in San Francisco, where I had just finished my first short story. I had also been trading technology stocks and doing remarkably well, capitalizing on the crazy possibility of the dot-com era, while helping Arcady establish his yoga business. We were talking about getting married and having a baby, so the time felt right now to bring him home. The contrast with Detroit as we drove into Grosse Pointe. There we go. A little light. Super. The contrast with Detroit as we drove in the Grosse Pointe was more striking than ever. The upscale shopping villages were flanked with Noah's Bagels. Brooks Brothers and Talbots, Mercedes and BMWs lined the streets. A clear sign that even the locals no longer bothered to buy American. "Where's the Whole Foods?" asked Arcady after we'd passed the A&P market. "There's just one," I told him. "We'll have to drive out to Troy tomorrow for the turkey." I didn't attempt to explain the differences between old money and new money in suburban Detroit, or the fact that old money Grosse Pointers would rather simply dine at their clubs than bother stocking their kitchens with locally sourced produce. But Arcady planned to make a totally organic Thanksgiving-style dinner for my family the following day. It was March. By this point, my family rarely gathered over the holidays and are always without Charlie. We had to seize the moment, Arcady felt. "I can't believe Charlie's going to be there," I mused. "He hasn't come home in 7 years. Not since the Christmas just after I filmed the family piece. It will be great for you to see him," Arcady said. "Family is so important." Like Detroit itself, Charlie had declined even further in recent years. After Bobby moved away from Dallas, first to Grosse Pointe and then Tortola, Charlie got into crack and other hard drugs. Unable to hold down a job, he no longer even tried to. To keep him off the streets, my parents had appointed Bill Penner as Charlie's trustee. It was Bill who paid the bills, rent, utilities, food, travel. Bill who controlled where Charlie went and what he did, and Bill who had succeeded until now at convincing Charlie to stay away from Grosse Pointe. Legally, my parents and Bill could not keep Charlie out of a shareholder meeting. Arcady ran his hand over his shaved head. "Of all your brothers, Charlie will be my favorite," he said. "I know it." My mother sat at the kitchen table knitting while Arcady stuffed the goose. There were no organic turkeys to be had in Michigan in March. I peeled potatoes at the sink. My mother's hair by now had gone completely gray, and her back was hunched from all the years of bending over backgammon tables and knitting projects, as she was bending over her knitting right now, in fact. The knitting needles clicked rhythmically to the hum of the dishwasher, just as the dice and backgammon pieces had once clicked across some sun-warmed corkboard at the club. Did my mother use the basic rhythm in these activities as an antidote to anxiety? I wondered. "Charlie can be at the house for dinner," she said, "but he'll have to stay at a hotel. His seedy friends have put him up to this, I know. The poor thing getting sent here by those grubs to get his hands on some money." Arcady shot me an alarmed look. Whereas I'd grown so used to my parents' callousness towards Charlie, I barely shrugged. "Maybe Charlie, just wants to come home," I offered. "It's been years since he's seen us. Charlie and I often talked by phone. Recently, he had confided in me that he had hepatitis C. My parents knew about this too, but it had not changed their attitude toward him." My mother shook her head. "No, dear, it's the meeting he's coming for." Arcady seasoned the bird, his back to us. I loved his old world values, good food, family bonds, and friends who mattered. He was deeply hospitable. He and his three brothers, talented musicians all, turned every gathering into a hearty celebration. How different they were from my family. I hoped Arcady would understand the situation with Charlie, that my mother simply couldn't handle this son of hers. If Charlie stayed at the house, the cascade of guilty feelings would be too much. And so it was her only defense, keeping Charlie at bay. Seeing how disturbed Arcady clearly was, however, I began to wonder if I should have brought him home for this particular weekend. Among the only times we convened as a family, the annual Stroh's business meetings were never happy occasions. Bobby, Whitney, and I always came home for the meeting, springing for expensive airline tickets only to be told just how badly the business was faring. After our acquisition of the bankrupt G. Heilman Brewing Company in 1996, landing another 15 or so declining brands in our portfolio, sales had continued to plummet. In 1999, we finally sold our entire brewing business to Miller and Pabst, who divided up our labels like so many spare parts. The family was crestfallen. Our 150-year brewing tradition gone, just like that. Miller Brewing bought out Henry Weinhard's and Mickey's brands. Pabst bought our 40 or so remaining brands, including all the Stroh's brands, which they soon buried. Even as its own label picked up a hipster cred, it parlayed into record profits. Internet chat rooms had filled up with conversations among our many loyal customers about what had happened to Stroh's beer. No one knew. Then, after the substantial business loans for the Heilman purchase had been paid off, the proceeds from the sale, just over 100 million, went directly into the equities markets, only to take an instant nosedive with the dot bomb. And since my father had sworn Bill Penner to secrecy about the terms of his post-nuptial agreement with Alyssa, my brothers and I weren't even sure if a sliver of interest still remained. Yet we still sprang for those airline tickets, if only because we knew these meetings would be the only chance we'd have to see each other. The evening went badly. The goose Arcady had procured was not a success, its tasteless meat yielding no drippings for gravy. In Russia, this would never happen, he said over and over as he sweated over the steaming bird carcass. Farm raised garbage. Trying to help him save the dinner, Bobby's blonde Louisianian wife, Cheryl, spent hours in the kitchen with Arcady, but it was no use. The American goose was just a total failure. Charlie came into the kitchen as soon as he arrived. It broke my heart to see how irretrievably his looks had been disfigured by the drugs and hard living. "How's my princess?" he said, wrapping me in a big hug, as if entirely unaware of the shock I was registering. A moment later, he was cheerful, chatting away with Arcady at the stove, bringing a can of old Milwaukee near beer to his lips now and again. My mother had asked him not to have any alcohol, and he seemed agreeable enough about this. None of us would be drinking at dinner. It would be cruel to drink in front of Charlie, my mother had said earlier that day, which was why my father and Alyssa had opted out of the gathering. When dinner was served, my mother sat at the head of the table in the dining room, her knitting pushed aside in a forlorn pile on the kitchen counter. She absently redistributed the food on her plate while Bobby, Whitney, and I discussed the agenda for the meeting the following day. When the conversation lagged, we sat around the table, staring at one another, unable to eat the tough, bone-dry goose meat. Whitney shifted restlessly in his chair, scuffing the wood floor. Bobby absently pulled on his mustache and looked at his watch. Charlie crossed and recrossed his legs impatiently, looking as if he might climb the walls. We all could have used a drink just then, but Charlie, he clearly needed one. Whitney jumped up from the table first to meet his friends at a bar. "If you'll please excuse me," he said in an official tone as he exited. "I'm expected elsewhere." Bobby, too, stood up, and then Cheryl. "Thank you, Arcady," she offered sweetly in her southern lilt. From the window, I watched them get into their car with somber faces and drive away. Charlie dropped his napkin on the table and quietly went upstairs. My mother insisted I follow him. "Go up and make sure he doesn't take anything," she whispered. All evening, she'd been trying to head off some imaginary disaster. Reluctantly, I stood up, and to appease her, I followed Charlie upstairs. I remembered a Christmas long before when he'd been accused of stealing $40 from my grandmother's purse. The family had made too big a deal out of it, talking in hushed tones about the pilfered money. He'd stolen from everyone else in the family as well, I knew, with the exception of perhaps me. From the very beginning, he'd always had my back. As soon as I reached the top of the stairwell, I veered into my room. Charlie had gone into Whitney's room, where I knew some of his old clothes still hung in the closet, along with some World War II Russian uniforms Whitney had collected. Franny, do you think Whitney'll mind if I take one of these shirts? Charlie, who must have heard me, called out. Wait, I thought that's who she was talking to. I walked through the shared bathroom into Whitney's room, where Charlie held up a blue Oxford shirt on a hanger. Why not? Those shirts have been there for years. Whitney has all his clothes down in Florida. Okay, just checking, he sniffed the shirt. Boy, you'd think Mom might get 'em cleaned once in a while, though. I took the shirt and looked it over. Maybe just keep it out overnight. The smell will go away. So you're staying here, huh? He said without the slightest trace of resentment. I'll stay down at the River Place Inn. I pictured the shirt hanging off the bedpost in his hotel room at Stroh River Place, the hotel that we'd developed, owned, and then lost in foreclosure, while Charlie slumbered underneath the sterile covers. Yes, I said, but I never sleep well here. I wish I could give him my room. Too bad. You could have joined me at the bar. I know, I hugged him. Hey, I'll see you in the morning, though, at the meeting. After Charlie left, Arcadia and I cleared the table, while my mother scrubbed the pots with a Brillo pad, steam rising around her exhausted face. The goose grease sat in a tomato soup can by the sink. Make sure you never give Charlie anything for Christmas that he could sell for drugs, she warned. Remember the time Bill Penner sent him the big screen TV? He wanted one so badly, and then he sold it within a week. She shook her head sadly and went over to take a pie out of the oven. The party had broken up before dessert was even served. I sat down at the kitchen table. Obviously, I'm going to send him a Christmas present, I said. Socks or underwear, though. That's what I do every year. My mother gave me this same advice every so often. I had yet to follow it. Come on, Mom. Realistically, how many pair of socks and underwear does he need? At least he'll know you were thinking of him. She dropped the pie from her oven glove onto the counter, knocking off a bit of crust. Poor Charlie. He was never as smart as the rest of you. I spent years helping him with his speech, helping him learn all the things that came naturally to you and Bobby and Whitney. He got a great deal of attention, more than all the rest of you put together, in fact. Yeah, well, Dad was pretty hard on him, I said. I flashed to Charlie, quickly gathering up all the Indian beads on the bed, as my father's footsteps came down the long hallway toward his room. Genes play a much larger role in how we develop that environment. The more I looked around, the more I see this. My mother sliced the pie and brought two plates over to the kitchen table. When Gary and John married Susie and Lou, there just wasn't enough variety of genes. For as long as I could remember, I'd been hearing my mother say the Stroh family's paltry dream gene pool came from those two brothers marrying two sisters, Susie and Lou, who drank martinis as if they were water. I leaned myself more toward the nurture side of the nature versus nurture debate. Dad picked on the defenseless ones, if you ask me, I said. Bobby and I turned out okay because he liked us better, don't you think? I mean, we could stand up to him, for one thing. Bobby had once told me a story about throwing a baked potato at my father in the course of an argument, which caused my father to back down with a sort of respect. My mother chewed her pie. I still think nearly all of it's genes. Genes are important, Arcadia agreed. They decide almost everything. I looked at my boyfriend as he loaded the dishwasher and for a moment wondered what planet he was from. Of course, that's what had attracted me to begin with, his utter certainty about things. I took a bite of pie and thought about all the years of misplaced blame in our family. Whether it was the business going down the tubes or Charlie's demise, no one wanted to take responsibility. Even our genes seemed more than convenient scapegoats. You're probably right, I told my mother. I didn't have the heart to challenge her. The truth would be too much to bear. I know I am, she said. Detroit, circa 1972. Its heyday. Actually, its heyday was in the 50s, but how many pages? It's not too many more. What's this? At 8:30 the next morning, the family assembled in a meeting room in our office building at Stroh River Place to await the presentations. 40 of us, cousins, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, and parents, whether related by blood or by marriage, sat united in our morbid curiosity about the fate of the falling business as well as our current or future financial interests. The room hushed when Charlie entered, and you couldn't blame anyone. In the glaring light of day, he looked like a homeless man as he ambled through the room, his skin leathery and blotched, eyes gazing vacantly ahead, making eye contact with no one. A homeless man dressed up for church by community do-gooders. His large nose appeared to have taken over his face, a face cut into an apple and left to dry. The blue Oxford shirt from Whitney's closet seemed to constrain his gestures, while the gray flannels and loafers he'd also taken from the house no longer fit his diminishing frame. He pulled out the chair next to mine with difficulty, catching the white tablecloth and disturbing the glasses of water at each place. The acidic fumes of stale alcohol rose off his skin and breath. I felt at once shame and compassion. This was my brother, even if many of the people in this room could hardly recognize him. Yet I was ashamed of what he'd become, as if his state somehow reflected on me. And recognizing my own wish to escape implication made me feel only worse. Waiting for the meeting to begin, Charlie crossed his legs and fixed his eyes on the overhead projector. I wasn't sure how much he would be able to take in. Surely he'd been absent for so long that the perils of the Detroit real estate market, the pension fund, and our biotechnology interests would mean little to him. My cousin John, smart in a blue blazer and perfectly tailored gray flannel trousers, walked to the front of the room. Having replaced Peter as the board's interim head in 1997, he still acted as our CEO and chairman. He welcomed the group and, smiling, began his opening presentation. Allow me to state the obvious. The fact that we continue to meet in this building, in a city that is literally falling apart all around us, is not exactly good news. Everyone laughed grimly. At dinner the night before, Bobby had characterized the situation with brilliant shorthand. Replacing Peter with John was like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Bobby had nailed it, though his metaphor left out any hint of responsibility. The fact was the Stroh Companies, Inc. board, as well as the family members who'd elected them, were responsible for this shipwreck. They had placed that fatal iceberg right in their own path. If we could pick this building up and put it down somewhere else, anywhere else, John continued, we'd be okay. But for better or worse, our real estate holdings are in Detroit. We can thank the United Auto Workers for bringing Michigan to its knees, one of my cousins piped in. The unions certainly haven't helped us, John agreed. If U.S. manufacturing had remained affordable for the big three, this wouldn't be the ghost town that it is. Passing the buck, it seemed, had reached epidemic proportions in this family, and I wanted some accountability. John, did we ever consider moving our headquarters elsewhere? I asked, after the Detroit brewery was closed in the mid-'80s, for example, and we had breweries all over the country. No one had a crystal ball, Franny, John responded smoothly, and uprooting management was not exactly an attractive option. He went on to deliver the complexities of the bad news with a confident sort of complacency that seemed to belie the dire circumstances in which we found ourselves. The business, now a holding company called Stroh Companies, Inc., SCI, with a basket of declining assets, would cease to exist within a certain number of years, and no one knew the exact number. Dividends would cease even sooner. As the automotive industry had declined and businesses had moved out of the city, so our real estate holdings had plummeted. Stroh River Place had been our most disastrous investment, representing a loss of close to 300 million, some of which had been bank loans, triggering foreclosures on the hotel and the apartment building. As for the office building we sat in, at 50% occupancy, it was now worth but a tiny fraction of what the family had invested in it. John moved on to the next line item, Spain. The Spanish government was suing us for a tax they believed we owed on our Spanish brewing interest, Cruz Campo, which we had sold to Guinness in the early 90s. For years, we'd been fighting the tax in the Spanish courts. If enforced, it would have totally wiped us out. In the meantime, the SCI board had voted to pay a substantial portion of the company's remaining equity out to the shareholders. So save your money, John advised ominously. We'll be dissolving the company soon. My relatives masked their panic by taking studious notes or simply staring ahead with blank expressions. Like my father, most of them had enjoyed quarterly dividend checks for as long as they could remember. Some had been saving, some hadn't. In our branch of the family, with my father as the only shareholder, my brothers and I had never received SCI dividends, and probably never would. I looked across the room and noticed that my father and Alyssa were just coming back from a cigarette break, giggling like teenagers, as if utterly oblivious to the bad news. Alyssa and I are having a ball spending your inheritance, my father loved to tell me. I knew he wasn't joking, but now even his own money supply was on the verge of tapping out. The company had been imploding while quarterly reports sat in an unopened pile on my father's kitchen counter. He and Alyssa busy spending his dividends before the checks had even arrived. Next, John moved to our biotechnology interest, Apex Bioscience, the company Uncle Peter had founded in the early 90s with $100 million of SCI funds. Just a few years later, John would sell this division to a German venture capital firm for nothing but a minor equity stake in lieu of proceeds. On an annual basis, the German initiated additional funding rounds in which we had to participate in order to keep our stake intact. Should we invest more funds in biotechnology? John asked the group. The venture capitalists were raising money for a phase 2 drug trial. We weren't even asked to vote or even to give our opinions. They're asking for a minimum investment of $2 million. We haven't committed at this level in over a year. Clearly, John was stumped, and the board always deferred to the family, meaning to John and Pierre, cousins who had inherited board seats from their fathers. For the very first time, John was turning to the family for direction. We wrote our votes on scraps of paper and put them into a hat. I voted in favor of the investment. What difference did it make? We were going down so fast we couldn't count our losses. And while it was a gamble, Apex Bioscience was the only investment in our portfolio that had any potential at all. As my father sometimes said, we should be a Harvard textbook case study on how not to run a business. Family owned and operated since 1775, our beer labels had boasted, but that was exactly our problem. In our system, fathers promoted their sons, and sons who too often had neither attended business school nor proven themselves in other corporate settings. Running a regional brewery was a far cry from running the beer giant we'd become in the 80s and 90s, and we'd simply blown it. When Alan Bond, the Australian financier, had made the Stroh Brewing Company a $1 billion offer in the mid-80s, our family-run board turned him down. Within just a few years, we were taking less than half that number from Coors, only to watch them back out of the deal. Our fire sale to Miller and Pabst in the late 90s had been the ultimate humiliation. At the last moment, Pabst backed out of the Stroh Brewery's pension liability, and still we'd agreed to the sale, shouldering the liability ourselves. Like most family members, I'd watched our business decline year after year from the sidelines. I could see now that many of these strategic pitfalls might have been avoided had seasoned professionals been at the helm. Family owned and with a family run board, we'd been in way over our heads once. We became the third largest North American brewer. Anheuser-Busch and Miller, number one and number two, respectively, were publicly traded companies with diversified boards and shareholders who kept a sharp eye on strategic decisions. Stroh shareholders, unless they happened to sit on the board, had no voice at all. These meetings were nothing more than elaborate smokescreens designed to foster a sense of agency, however false, among the rest of us. When Uncle Peter retired in 1997, some of us had pushed for hiring outside talent instead of appointing yet another Stroh family member to run the business. But with the family divided on the question, the status quo had prevailed, and now, yet again, it seemed we were paying the price. Suddenly, Charlie spoke up. John, I have hepatitis C, and well, I need financial support for my medical care and living expenses. The room gasped. The drug addict's disease. Or one of them, anyway. Everyone looked at Charlie stunned. So, how would I go about getting a guarantee of financial support? He continued. John, who had married a wealthy woman, cleared his throat. Those of us who need support, he intoned, brows raised in seeming concern, will have to turn to our parents. My father shot Alyssa a theatrical look of alarm. She grinned wanly and patted his knee. My mother did not lift her eyes from her knitting. Charlie crossed his arms and sank into his chair. I was proud of him, though, for speaking up. Many of us had watched our parents' generation spending the family wealth all our lives, but only Charlie had showed the courage to ask, what about me? I leaned back into my seat and stared up at the ceiling. Every time I attended a Stroh business weekend, I swore I'd never attend another one. I felt forever caught between wishing we'd just hurry up and lose it all and hoping we could save ourselves. But John's response to Charlie's question seemed to make it perfectly clear there would be no road back. At lunch, everyone steered clear of Charlie. I walked over and sat down in the seat next to him. Hey, Franny, he said, his mouth full. How's the pasta? I asked, knowing the food would be perfectly tasteless. Charlie pulled his napkin onto his lap when he saw me do it. Not bad. Better than that goose last night, he laughed. Hey, I like Arcady, though. You know, he's a good guy. I just couldn't stick around after dinner. Mom was too nervous. I can't stand being around her when she's like that. I spotted my mother at a table across the room with Nicole and Pierre. What did you think of the meeting? Nothing new, right? Said Charlie. The ship's been sinking since I can remember. No kidding. Anyway, sorry about the goose, he said. Arcady worked like hell on that meal. It really wasn't his fault. He likes you too, Charlie. Later, back in San Francisco, Arcady would tell me that Charlie had pulled him aside and said, You take care of my princess, okay? Maple Leaves 2000 by Eric Stroh. And that's going to be it. That's going to be it for now. 39 minutes of heedless reading.